So Odin, why don't we start by getting to know a little bit about how you came to the carbon finance business?
That's a story in itself.
Yeah.
But I came into the carbon business in the summer of 2004. And basically Ken Newcomb, and I switched positions. I was the senior advisor in the front office. He took over that, and I came in as the manager of the carbon fund. And it was a particularly interesting time because the carbon business from the outside in the bank was basically viewed as this little enclave. You know, what was it? I mean, who were these people? I mean, it wasn't composed of regular bank staff that had done development projects all around the world. It even had people seconded from, Japanese utilities and every place else in the world. And it sat off by itself, and it sat with its own funding. I mean, what was happening there? Was it a new bank being created? A new kind of creature that was there? It had a lot of the signs of the private sector, with committees and making decisions, investment committees essentially, and along the way. I don't think what I used to call the green visor people, the people that were overseeing, had any kind of concept of what was going on there. What they could see was in this trust fund the accumulation of more and more money. You had the country funds, and then you had the PCF, Prototype Carbon Fund. And so you had this diversity on top of everything else. How could this possibly work? What was going to happen? And there was a basic misunderstanding at that point in time. The bank judges success and failure in many ways by commitments, how much funds have been committed, and disbursements. So we're sitting there with about $1.4 billion, and it looks like really minimal commitments. And if you project ahead, it doesn't look like you're ever going to use up $1.4 billion. And we're starting to get on the side part complaints from the from the Dutch. What's happening? Where's our credits? And you're having other things. So the risk to the bank was high. And my job was to go in and unclear what to do about this thing. But it was clear we need to be a business, and we need to manage this situation, and we basically need to disperse. That was the kind of thing. So the first challenge was that we had this incredibly diverse group of investors who came in mostly with a private sector viewpoint. They were in a fund. I mean, there was what today we would call a hedge fund, NatSource, in there. There were Japanese utilities, Japanese companies, European companies, European utilities, and then we had the country representatives, the Spanish, the Dutch, the Danes. So this was not a homogeneous group. They had different pressures on them and different commitments. But as 2004 progressed, they had one thing that was in common, and that was they needed carbon credits. The market was short, and when the market is short like that, and you have a potential that there's not going to be sufficient supply, there's no telling what the price of energy reduction or carbon reductions could go to, and that would translate directly into energy prices, and then would have perhaps political repercussions in Europe and Japan. So it wasn't a normal kind of World Bank trust fund and everything. There was considerable risk to the bank. And the original concept was that these carbon business would be integrated into the project business. That there would be projects, and as an add-on would be the carbon business. But that wasn't materializing. The regions weren't interested in it. It was too little money for too much effort and too much expense. So what was the solution? And the solution turned out to be HFC 123, a highly toxic greenhouse gas. Depending on which number you want to take, 11,000 to 14,000 times the toxicity to the planet of carbon dioxide. So this way. And there was absolutely no reason for this gas to be abated. It didn't cloud the skies. It didn't cause pollution like coal-fired power plants in that typical localized sense. And it was a byproduct of another gas that was the main chemical that was being produced and that was growing quickly, which was HCFC 22 and CFC 22. So here was the gas. The question was, the major plants that were producing this were in China. And China had not at this point in time shown much interest in the carbon markets. It was still in the beginning stages of this. And then you, Chandra, were a big motivator of moving in this direction. The risks here was that this was something outside of what we would say is in the green movement. It wasn't growing trees, which were ineligible under the Kyoto Protocol, or we couldn't get a market going. We could do some reforestation, but not. It wasn't renewable energy. It wasn't beautiful windmills up on the hills. It wasn't solar plants. It wasn't small-scale irrigation running down Chilean hillsides. It was chemicals in the middle of industrial complexes, and very, very dirty industrial complexes. The other problem that we faced at that point in time was, who were we? Were we representatives of this buyer's fund? Which would be, if we were in the private sector, we were purely in the private sector, it would be very clear. Our fiduciary responsibilities were for these buyers, these investors, but that's not the World Bank. The World Bank was development. It was poverty alleviation. It was trying to do good in the world. So we're going out to small countries, some big countries and things, negotiating contracts and everything else on prices. I mean, there's economics on both sides of this. So whose side are we on? Are we on these big utilities from Japan and Europe? Or are we on the Chilean village that has small-scale irrigation? That's another question. And how do we solve this? I mean, clearly now this HFC 123, we're going to be dealing with multi-million-dollar chemical companies. Those are not the small guys by definition. So how do we now, justify this? And as I was saying before, the market is starting to shake. The market is starting to show signs that there isn't the supply of offsets going into it, and the shortage is starting to come. So we started this long process of negotiation.
When you came in 2004, I think signs were there that Russia was going to ratify. In 2005, the Europeans were pushing Russia with the threat of boycott of their gas trade. And so there was optimism that the market is going to take off. And as you say, as you just said, there was a sense that the demand would be there, the supply wasn't there. And in around February 2005, Russia did ratify and change the whole thing, right? The pressure on us and everybody else was there. And
Right.
that's the context of the HFC project, right?
Right. And we're basically, up to that point, before the ratification of the Kyoto, we were in kind of a voluntary market. You know, it wasn't clear at that point, but the signs there were in 2004, Russia was going to come in to the business as such. So that was the situation. And we started these negotiations in China. It took a long time. I think we signed the term sheet sometime in, what was it?
March, I think.
Was it March?
March 2005. I think we had a meeting in Kyoto of the prototype carbon fund, and then we flew down to Shanghai, signed
Right.
the term sheets.
Right.
And
Well, that was an interesting meeting in Kyoto, because now we're going to have to basically tell these people that the original concept of we're going to put a little bit of money here and a little bit of money there, and we're going to have a diversified portfolio is off the table. We're coming to them and we're saying, we need to disperse, we need to commit your funds, we need to create credits, we're going to go for HFC 123, and you're either in or you're out. We're not obligating you to buy it, we're not obligating you to do it, it's going to be voluntary. And whatever we do that doesn't go to you goes to the market. And I can remember the kind, and I said it basically gets down to you're going to get credits or you're not. That's it. And they could see by now that it was not working, that we were not getting credits, at least in time for this market peak. And so, but we still had to face, is this development or not? And I don't know if it was you or what came up with the idea that we would convince the Chinese government that they would tax these profits from these credits at 65%. And this 65% would go into a clean development fund to be used by the Chinese to expand their domestic market, to create projects, to make equity investments in renewable energy and everything else. So the next challenge was convincing the government to do this. Now, this doesn't make the industry very happy to say, we're going to be taxed at 65%, you know, and this thing. And after many meetings and long delays, the Chinese agreed to the 65% tax. And then we went into negotiations. The term sheet was going to expire in December. We were there in the cold in Beijing. I think we were in Beijing, negotiating this deal over 3 days in Chinese with Chinese lawyers and everything else. You know, at the moment there, you know, thank God for iPads and things like this to divert the discussion. And on top of that, we had our environmental people there to make sure that these plants were environmentally sound and everything else. So they're imposing additional costs along the way, you know, being their demanding self, and how is this going to get funded? And we thought we would lose one of the plants. And we signed the deal. Basically on Saturday, on a Monday. Monday, we closed negotiations on Friday. There was some hesitation back in the bank whether we should go forward to it or not. And the deal was done. The carbon funds, I think, picked up around 500 million. They picked up around 500 million out of that, which dispersed. You know, we still left a lot of money in the carbon fund for other projects. And then we auctioned the remaining bits to the private sector. And that went like in, I think, 6 minutes, and it was done. We now had a thing. We also created a buffer fund, almost a brokerage commission fee. That was, the idea was that when the Kyoto Protocol expires, or when the business expires, we would have the money to continue on and go into new creative things. And I think that maybe not with that funding, but the bank went on and has done very, very creative things. So that's the story.
So, the success of the HFC project, the contract size was 775 million euros. And, I remember Mitsui, or one of the companies, telling us that within weeks of entering into the contract, they sold their share of the reductions at a multiple of the price that they had paid, and that created a huge liquidity in the market, and was, as you will remember probably, that it was led to the total shift in the market size and interest. How do you think, or what was the role of the bank overall in putting together the carbon market and the interest that came into the market from, I think, 2006 to about 2010, in terms of the capacity, in terms of the type of firms and so on that came into the business?
Well, I think what happened after that, one was that liquidity in the market increased, and markets to be stable. And the carbon market was not stable. The allowance prices were not stable. They would, I think they fell one time from 30 euro to 10 euro or 11 euro almost overnight. So it needed liquidity. And the market players, investors, need liquidity. Otherwise the market becomes too unstable. So that was the beginning. Then we also have the banks, the investment banks, now see that there is money to be made, that there is now trade taking place. Carbon is now the third largest commodity traded in the world, behind oil, and we think coffee or slashed cotton along the way. It was a huge, above the cereals. Mm-hmm. So it is a huge commodity business. So now we have new investors coming in, and we have companies like Echo Securities, which had been in the market, are out there creating projects. And everybody is trying to innovate now, thinking of different things. Where can we go? What gas can we abate? We're really putting the creative energies of the market and investors to play. This was suddenly big business. And the projections were to be bigger business. Why? The United States. Was the United States going to come into the carbon markets? Because if the United States came in, it was going to change everything. And we knew at some point in time that there wasn't going to be a free rider effect that the clean development mechanism created. There was going to be commitments that were going to have to be made. And you have to recall back that when the Kyoto Protocol was done, as it reminded me of, was that the intention was that Europe wanted a top-down command kind of system. And it was the US that had pushed for a carbon market after their successes with abatement of sulfur dioxide, where they had created the first environmental market in the world. So there was great optimism and an amazing flow of investments and creativity that was taking place along that way. And I believe a part of that was the amazing liquidity, the economic incentives that the HFC came, and then later nitrous oxide, created for the market. And then that would allow then the expansion and investment in renewables and other products.
So looking back, by the time you had come to the carbon market, you had a long career in the bank and right. Through a lot of operational work and so on. So from your recollection, you talked a little bit about how this was not, the unit was not representative of the type of people that the bank was familiar with. But what are your recollections in terms of what allowed this business to do so much innovation, and what lessons does it have for people today, both young people and managers, as to how they could promote innovation, new products, that creative energy that is needed in order to address the challenge of climate change?
Okay, well, as you know, till the day I retired, which was right out of the carbon business, I spent 27 years in the bank doing everything from child nutrition projects to trying to bring peace to the Middle East and work with Arafat and incredible Afghan refugees and things like that. So it was a long career. The bank and any bureaucracy, big bureaucracy in a public institution, isn't receptive for entrepreneurs. I can remember that they did these surveys, and it basically creates introverts, people who are not risk takers, people who take no for an answer, and the equation of reward and punishment in a bank is essentially you get punished for mistakes and you don't get much reward for success. And it's a little bit of a clubbishness. You scratch my back, I'll scratch your back, and things like this. So to create an atmosphere of for entrepreneurs to exist and to be a success is difficult, and it requires something. I mean, Ken was that kind of guy. I never, ever remember Ken taking no for an answer. There was always a workaround, right? And I like to think of myself as a little bit of that entrepreneur. I got in a lot of trouble in the bank, especially when I was running in Gaza and that thing where I felt that the chance of making success in the Middle East, of getting peace in the Middle East, and this was really, I felt, one of the only opportunities to do this peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, was worth all that, of saying no and abusing the green visor people, as I used to call them, as I said before. And that requires a lot of courage and maybe a little concealment, which Ken was a. And so I think, that how do you create that for the future? I remember reading the evaluation report of the PCF, and one of the things was what was going on. What was this new bank being created? Where was all the money? What are you guys doing? What's happening in there? How do you create that? How do you create that atmosphere? I think we have to reach out to, Elon Muskie. You have to protect people like that. At the time, we were fortunate. We have Jim Wolfenson, who was an investment banker. He came from that entrepreneurial type of thing. So I think you have to reach out for the leadership in multilateral institutions to those kind of people. It's a difficult transition for them, if they come from that entrepreneurial kind of world, because you're in a big web, and there's a lot of spiders in that web that can. So you have to sort of negotiate that, and very, very few people are successful at doing that. And I don't know. Maybe it can't be done. It's still being done in the carbon business. It's still out there on the fringes, and being. So it's extremely difficult. But there has to be a conscious culture of promoting entrepreneurs. And part of that will come about by bringing people in from the private sector. And the other part is making the partnerships, the public-private partnerships. Because one thing about the private sector is it is minimal on bull. It has a clear objective. It needs to get done. And even institutions like the IFC, which is supposed to work to it, when I was in the investment bank world, are viewed as too slow, too bureaucratic, too thing. So you go to them for other reasons. You don't go to them to do creating projects. So that is the difficulty.
So if it is so difficult in an institution like the bank, why should it be done in the bank? I mean, that was one of the questions that was there in the early part of the carbon market as well. Is there a role for an institution like the bank on global public goods? What makes the bank, institution like the bank, influential in the area of trying to work on issues like climate change or carbon markets?
Well, the bank, its basic comparative advantage is convening power. As long as it can keep its reputation high, it can bring together actors from the private sector, the public sector, and from the NGO community. And that's a rarity. It doesn't have the financial clout in the market that, or in the world that it had when in the 1960s and 1970s, when it was sort of the exclusive financer of developing countries. China doesn't need us. India doesn't need us. JP Morgan doesn't need us. Goldman Sachs doesn't need us. Hedge funds don't need us. So it has to be able to bring those players together in the convening power. It has to be prepared to take some risks. And the major risk that the bank faces is not financial risk, because it's not going to expose itself to that and then risk its rating in the credit markets. It's basically reputational risk. The movement into HFC 23 was a risk, a huge reputational risk. There was no reputational risk to doing a wind power plant, or solar, or forestry. There was some risks in displacing indigenous people and things, but so it has to be willing to take those kinds of risks, and that's difficult for an institution. But it has to work with the private sector. It has to do public-private partnerships, and it has to just light the flame, and then it steps aside. And I think the big question of the continuation of the carbon business is, can it step aside? Or does it become so embedded in whatever the plan was, or some way self-serving interest, that it doesn't have the flexibility to step aside? I remember at that time, we really considered, should we just end the carbon business at that point, that part of the carbon business? The private sector was coming up. We provided liquidity. We had written, I don't remember how many methodologies, but well in the teens. Mm-hmm. Should we have stepped aside and said, okay, that's done. Now we're going into just do biocarbon or community where there isn't demand where there isn't, people don't want to enter it. It's too risky. It's too small.
Mm. So I remember the discussion at that point of time when we had done the HFC project. We had taken a strategy to the board as well, where the first 7-8 years of our engagement in the carbon market was to create the demand by aggregating investors and industrialized countries to create the demand for these offsets. And that with the HFC 23 project, I think with a huge demand and certainly the World Bank's carbon funds growing to about $1.4, $1.5 billion, that perhaps the time had come for us to shift our role to representing the sellers by creating the appropriate supply, as you were just mentioning. Why do you think the World Bank never made that transition? Why did we continue to develop more and more carbon funds and not let the JP Morgans and the Goldman Sachs and the hedge funds in London take over the business?
It's a good question. I mean, if we go back to the original vision of the PCF, it was the integration of this additional revenue incentives to go into the mainstream of bank projects. So we'd have essentially the normal business of creating projects in the world, of things like, and on it would be this bonus thing. And I think, I mean, you were in the bank, you worked on Mexico, you worked on Brazil. I think there was some success in doing that, at least in big sector loans and big incentive loans to create that policy base. But I remember in our time, what we tried to do was to move our people into the regions, because we needed advocates in the regions themselves. We couldn't be sitting there in the kind of enclave of the carbon business. They had to be out there. They had to be working next door to the people. But I don't really know how successful it was. It should be the model. It should be that kind of creation. It also opens the door for the private sector to come in. And I think it's one of the mysteries of it. I know part of it is the pressure that project officers face. When I was a project officer along the way, to make the timetable of a project, to keep it from being complex, to avoid going to the inspection panel. You bring in carbon, you bring in all that stuff, another piece of the equation that puts at a risk that you will end up in the inspection panel, because somebody objects to it. I remember we walked away from a landfill project in South Africa. Good project, probably could create a lot of benefit, have that landfill much better managed. But we were going to be bogged down by issues and things and accusations of previous damage that the landfills had made to the health of the communities and things like that. And I remember it was one of the sour moments for me.
The Durban project.
Yeah, that we walked from it, because we should have, taken on that challenge, but, we would have locked up part of the team and good necessary people. So there was an opportunity cost, a sacrifice that we would have had to make along the way.
And in terms of the approach, I think in the first decade or so of the carbon business, the World Bank has accumulated dozen or more of trust funds with a total of over $3 billion now. Is that the correct model going forward? Do we need to be the ones operating very inflexible trust funds, applying fairly inflexible policies and instruments, or should there be a different kind of a model? Now I'm obviously trying to get you
Let me see if I can get the right answer here. Would you make it a multiple choice with none of the above?
Yeah, no, I mean, is there a possibility that perhaps the bank plays more of a convening power kind, where it has a comparative advantage and helps arrange transactions, and therefore a arranger, as the financial markets call it, where you could put together a financial product rather than to actually manage the financial product?
Yeah. I mean, anytime we manage in one of those big financial products, there's great risk. I did a review as a consultant of the forestry funds recently. I don't think it saw the light of day. Mm-hmm. But it was almost like deja vu. You have these incredibly high expectations that are being built, tremendous risks. I mean, one of the things in the private sector and the banking system, as you remember, we red flagged everything. All the little tremendous risks of not only fiduciary risks, but risks on the ground and expectations. We are going to protect the forests of the DRC, of the Congo. And we're going to have these multiple outcomes that's going to take place. We don't have that capacity. We don't have that capability. And there can be tremendous disappointment that comes out of that. So I think it's a great risk to the bank to be managing certainly $3 billion. I mean, we had enough trouble with $1.4 billion, and there's no HFC out there waiting to save those funds.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of looking back over the period that you were involved, what would your message be to people who are trying to develop the business now and trying to look into the future linked to the Paris Agreement? What were the successes through the Kyoto Protocol which can be taken forward? What are the failures that should not be repeated as we move forward with the Paris Agreement?
Well, I learned early on in the Middle East. I mean, I don't want to make an analogy between the Middle East and the carbon business, but there are tremendous similarities. We did have a lot of money in the Middle East through the Holtz Fund. It was a similar type of situation. Is that we are hostage to the political agenda. If that envelope does not move, no matter what we do, we cannot. We're stuck within what those parameters are. In the case of the Middle East, we were not able to go into areas of there because the agreement had not opened up. Like in the beginning, it was just Gaza and Jericho. We could not build roads even into the West Bank, or we can even repair schools in the West Bank. So there was and it's the same thing at the carbon market and the carbon business and the forestry thing. Unless the political agenda permits us as worldwide agreements to go forward. My message is that carbon pricing, carbon markets are absolutely essential for targeting climate change. I did a paper recently that was published and looking at a world that says, okay, you're responsible, let's say, from 1991 for your emissions, because that's the Rio Agreement. At that point in time, you knew that you were doing damage to the world. And combine that with an ability to pay, which basically said, even China, because they have people who have income above, say, $2,000, should pay something. Obviously the poor shouldn't, but somebody should pay. How you pay is a different thing. And then come through with obligations. And what I did was I put a 50-50 weight on your ability to pay and your contribution to putting this pollution into our atmosphere. And the results are kind of interesting. Countries like Zambia or in Africa have basically no obligation. They did not contribute that much to the atmosphere, and when you take into account the income distribution and the amount of income, they don't have that many people that are above, let's say, $2,000 or $3,000 per capita income. So they don't have much. They're basically clean development mechanism countries. Mm-hmm. They don't have it. But China has an obligation, I think. And interestingly, Europe, United States, Japan, the countries that were the buyers in the Kyoto Protocol, have to reduce their emissions to negative. And in other words, in theory, or to fulfill that requirements, they have to go negative. How do you go negative? Well, you can do some sequestration and things like this. But the way you go negative is essentially what was in the Kyoto Protocol. And that's buying offsets from other countries that will have the freedom, that have the headroom. They need to create more headroom. Even China, you could buy it. If China exceeds their obligations, let's say under a new Paris II agreement. So a global carbon market, if we take climate change seriously, is necessary. But it's going to be country-based, somewhat in the accords of the Paris Agreement. And it should take into account the responsibilities for the existing atmospheric pollution and the ability to pay. And so that I see as the future. That is why carbon markets are needed. If we take it, okay, we'll take 6 degrees, centigrade. And maybe we don't need a carbon market. We just boil. We move inland. But that's not the case. We won't tolerate it. So it's, will the political do it? How does the bank contribute to that? The bank has, been a leading advocate of carbon pricing around the world. It has shown that carbon markets can work, that players can, multilaterals and other institutions can work with private sectors hand in hand. It showed that there's a willingness of large investment banks to come in, because no chance, absolutely no chance without large flows of investment, and they're going to chase profits. That's the game. Very few companies are set up to lose money. The shareholders still seem to enjoy that. So that is the future. And the seeds were planted back in 1998, and continued forward. It's been demonstrated that it can work. Yeah, there's mistakes, there's constraints. The UN was slow, and et cetera, but those can be fixed. The California market is quite an interesting market, and I think for my mind, is the model. It has a floor price that's increasing over time, and it has a ceiling price, and it has increasingly ambitious targets. Why the floor and why the floor and why the ceiling? Because it gives some stability for long-term investments. That knowing that $14 a ton is the minimum price I can receive. Might go a little bit below that, but and the way that they allocate over time, the allowances, allows even kind of more stability. So you have flexibility between wide ranges, but some stability for long-term investment. And that stability will draw in more longer-term, 7-year, 8-year contracts that you need for wind power and solar.
So given your experience both inside the bank, long experience inside the bank, and then subsequently in the investment banking sector, where do you see the comparative advantages of the two kind of institutions in promoting carbon pricing in general?
Okay. Well, the obvious thing for the banks and the private sector is that they're willing to take risk. They're not, and the importance of the banking sector is, like in all the markets, they can increase liquidity and they can reduce risk. How do they reduce risk? By creating products. They can hedge. They can create products that can allow some hedging for those buyers in the market that do not want to take the risk of fluctuating prices. The public sector, obviously has the role. The governments have the role of setting the regulations and how the system would work, and to monitor the market to make sure that there's not fraud. And we did have incidents of fraud in the market. And but the public institutions, I think, are the ones who can take some of the development risks. They can innovate, bring in new kinds of products to the market. They can give some assurances that if you go into a post-conflict country, for example, that there's some security that your investments will not be expropriated. MIGA has a role in that if you're going to build something and you're going to do something, that you have some security that your investments will be protected if there's a coup d'etat or even a a revolution or a civil war that breaks out. So there still is a role for that, and there's a role of innovation. But at the same time, the multilaterals and the public institutions have to realize that they have their own limits, that they have to be careful that if they're going to step on the toes of the private sector, they only step on them initially, and then they get off their toes. And we did something. It's up to the world to take it further. I think one of the mistakes that we made, looking at, is we should have built a much stronger communication strategy outside the bank. We were in some ways insular into our own thing and our own investors and our own clients as to such. We should have been out there explaining a lot more. We did it within the carbon forums and things like that, but that was a club, a large club, but it was a club. It wasn't taken so much out where we really had kind of a modern communication strategy that was around it, because again, that would have been part of the benefits. And we would have taken heat, but as somebody said, when you're in the kitchen and the oven is hot, but there's a product in there, we got to take the heat.
So I would gather from that the role of public institutions, particularly such as the bank, is primarily to address the regulatory uncertainty and create some sort of predictability of policy and regulation, and then allow the private sector to take the financial and market risks.
Yes.
That would be
right, and we should be, doing the analysis, economic analysis. We have a role to play with our owners, our governments, to sit down and explain things, to get their point of view. They're not going to share it with J.P. Morgan. They're going to much more with the bank. The bank does have what we've called a technical role. It's not browbeating. It's not going in there and saying, unless you do this, you don't get the loan. It's a collaborative, trusting relationship. We've seen this work in India, and we would like you to see if you're interested in it in Brazil. That cross-fertilization. I don't know, I'm not in the bank anymore, but I think there's less of that that's taking place. And it should be that, you work in South Asia, but you've also worked in Latin America. And we need to take those experiences and share them. So we should be trusted consultants, advisors to our governments, both industrial and obviously the developing countries that are also our members.
And to conclude, based on your long experience inside the bank and after leaving the bank in the private sector, what would your advice be to the people who are trying to develop new products linked to the carbon market in the bank today?
One, exercise at noontime for sure, because you're going to have a lot of strain. I think what maybe doesn't make successful bank people in the sense of success in the normal time. Do I get promoted to this level or that level? Do I become a high-level manager in the bank, or do I not? I think for people in the bank, what is the real benefit or the real reward is having a higher goal than your day-to-day, I want to be at an eye level, or I want to be this level, or and keep focused on that. You may be disappointed, but that's it. And it makes life, you can take much more abuse in that. But if you're in there, I mean, in a naive way, I went to the Middle East against a lot of advice. They said to Palestine, they said they're going to kill you, and I had this vision of peace for the Middle East. I went into the carbon business with you guys, basically, to address, and I continue to, and I continue to even after J.P. Morgan, is the greatest threat to humanity, to Homo sapiens, ever, or at least unless we retreat into a little Mount Everest or something like that. So those are the big challenges, and I think those people, and I admire them, and there are many of them, who can keep that as their motivation. And then you can run into problems. You can go home and say, well, so-and-so did this and that, and it doesn't look like I'll get the next promotion or I'll be able to walk it. But you created a meaningful life. And you get enough people together like that, and you get results. Not all the time, but you get results. And then you collect people like that around you. And when you collect people like that around you, and you have that inclination, you can become a leader and create wonderful, wonderful things like maybe what we planted, that little catalytic thing called the carbon business.
My own experience, Odin, in the bank is that it allows you unbelievable amount of freedom, as long as you don't want to get into the race for the level in the bureaucracy, that it allows you unbelievable amount of space to innovate and do things that you really want to do. It allows you not just the space, but also has the resources. It's one of the few institutions in the world which gives you time and money to do things which outside environments don't allow you to do, including J.P. Morgan.
Right.
So,
at J.P. Morgan, there was a clear matrix there.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember that very clearly.
But I think, in going a little bit more to what you're saying there, I think, to work at the World Bank, the way I viewed it from the day I came in, was a gift. It was a gift to have a meaningful life, to be able to make a better world. It sounds naive, and it sounds, like, oh my God, what get real, get real, But it's true. And the bank is a gift, and sometimes I've come here on a Friday and everybody's gone. I said, where are you? This should be like the bunkers under World War II with Churchill. Everybody there, everybody on board deck. Go for it. What an opportunity! What a thing to come out of it and be my age, and say back, I had a meaningful life. You can have a meaningful life. You don't have to go to the World Bank. You can become a religious leader or something like this, or work in a hospital, or even sell hot dogs on the street and be friendly. So it's not necessary. But when you're here, you have this very, very powerful instrument, and you're part of that powerful instrument. So why waste the time? Why waste the life energy?
Thanks a lot. It was a pleasure.